The trail dust parted to reveal a sight no cowboy expected. A girl, no older than 12, standing barefoot on the scorched earth. Her head was shaven clean, her eyes hollow as if she had forgotten how to cry. She wore no shoes, carried no name, spoke no word. Just silence, and silence on the frontier was heavier than gunfire. The cowboy reined in, staring at her fragile frame against the endless sky. Who had stripped her of everything? And why had they left her here, where even the coyotes gave no mercy? In that moment, he knew the West had delivered him not chance, but a burden, and perhaps a redemption he never asked for. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The cowboy Elias Boone, a man whose name was known in some towns and forgotten in others, shifted in the saddle as he leaned down, extending a calloused hand toward the strange figure that the desert had given him. And though he half expected her to shy, to flinch, to bolt into the endless stretch of nothing like a frightened colt, the girl did not move except to blink once, slow and hollow, before placing her small palm into his, her touch dry, her skin cold despite the sun's burn. With a steady pull he drew her up, setting her across the saddle before him. Her thin legs dangling, toes dragging lines into the dust as he nudged his horse forward, and the silence that wrapped around them was thicker than the heat itself, a silence that gnawed at him worse than the hunger in his belly or the thirst in his throat, because he had known the company of talkers, of drunkards, of men who would not shut their mouths even when death sat close by, but never had he known a companion whose presence was so complete and yet so void, who seemed more specter than child. Elias cleared his throat once, muttered something half-hearted about the trail ahead, about needing to reach the river by sundown. But no reply came, no shift of expression, no flicker in those hollow eyes that seemed too old for 12, and he found himself staring at her in the corner of his vision, uneasy in a way he had not been even under gunpoint, for a child's silence felt heavier than a grown man's curse, heavier even than the sound of gunfire on a lonesome night. The horse plodded on, hooves muffled in the dust, and with every sway of the saddle he became more aware of the girl's weight, not much, but enough to remind him that she was real, flesh and bone, that he had not conjured her from heat shimmer or loneliness, though something about her presence made him wonder if she belonged to this earth at all. He thought of the towns he had passed, the burned-out wagons, the graves marked and unmarked that lined forgotten trails, and he tried to stitch together a story in his mind: soldiers, raiders, sickness, cruelty. But every version nodded against itself, unraveling beneath the vacant steadiness of her gaze. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint wail of a coyote somewhere far off, and Elias tightened his grip on the reins, muttering a curse under his breath, because the coyotes would smell her weakness, they would smell her silence, and he knew better than to underestimate beasts who thrived on what the desert discarded. Still, the girl offered no fear, no shiver, no sound, and he wondered if perhaps fear had been bled out of her long before he came upon her, leaving nothing but this shell that clung without clinging. His horse snorted, weary but steady, and Elias leaned closer, whispering more to himself than to her, "Reckon you're mine now, like it or not," though the words tasted bitter, for he had not asked for a companion, much less a child who carried no name, no past, no voice. Yet as the sun sagged toward the rim of the earth and the shadows stretched long, he realized with a pang that the trail felt less empty, the silence less cruel, because though she spoke not a word, her bare feet swinging above the dust, she was there, and her silence, heavy as it was, now belonged to him too. When Elias Boone rode into the hard-scrabble settlement of Red Bluff with the girl perched before him, her bare feet brushing the dust, the usual rhythm of the place faltered, the blacksmith's hammer stilled mid-strike, the barkeep leaned half out the swinging doors, and women at the well turned their heads sharply, their whispers quick as rattlesnakes in dry grass. It wasn't just that he brought a child. But what kind of child? A shaven-headed slip of a girl with hollow eyes that took in the town without blinking, her silence clinging to her like a shroud, and soon the murmurs hardened into words: Chinese, bad omen, cursed, she don't belong here, phrases spit with the same suspicion they reserved for strange weather or cattle disease, for out on the frontier difference was a thread as sharp as a knife, and superstition took root faster than wheat in any soil. Elias felt the weight of their stares, the sudden pressure of being marked as a man who carried something unwelcome, and he dismounted slow, keeping a hand on the girl's shoulder as she slid down with that same eerie compliance, standing barefoot in the street while dust curled around her ankles. And though she made no sound, no move, the crowd around them shifted as if she were a spark poised over dry tinder. An old woman spat into the dirt, muttering that silence like that was a curse, that a child with no voice was bound to bring ruin, while a young man face flushed with drink, though it was hardly noon, shouted that Elias ought to turn her back to the desert, let the coyotes take what was already marked for death. And others nodded, their fear clothed as righteousness, their unease sharpened into the language of demand. Elias tightened his jaw, his eyes sweeping over them, and though he had no kin in Red Bluff, no loyalty to its dust-bitten streets, he felt the old burn of defiance rise in his chest, the same heat that had carried him through nights when men turned on him for less. He told himself he owed this girl nothing, that he could set her down here and ride on, leave her to the hands of others. Yet when he looked at her, still as a statue, her eyes not pleading but empty, he realized that if he abandoned her to this crowd, it would not be the coyotes that tore her apart, but the whispers, the suspicion, the cruelty born from fear of what they could not name, and his hand on her shoulder became an anchor, silent but firm. The sheriff finally stepped forward, a tall man with lines carved deep into his face, and his voice cut through the muttering like a knife, calm but carrying steel. This ain't your fight, Boone, but if you bring her here, it becomes ours. Folks don't like omens. Folks don't like silence. Elias met his gaze, felt the warning in it, the weight of a man speaking not only for the law, but for the crowd's restless hunger. And he nodded once, slow, his voice gravel when he finally answered. She ain't an omen. She's a child. That's all. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the words strain against the truth of what he had seen on that scorched trail. The sound that still clung in his memory like a ghost, her whisper, fragile and impossible, of Mama. He wondered if the town would hear it too, if they would brand it miracle or curse, and he reckoned he could not let them decide. Sheriff Amos Cutter, a man with shoulders broad as a barn door and eyes gone pale from years of staring down both men and weather, caught Elias Boone by the arm and steered him away from the crowd's hungry stares. His grip iron, his voice low enough to keep the townsfolk straining to hear but not bold enough to accuse outright. They slipped into the shade of the sheriff's office, where the dust motes floated slow in the thin shafts of light, and Amos let go of Boone only long enough to slam the door shut before he growled. You don't want this trouble, son. Not here. Not anywhere. He leaned close, the brim of his hat shadowing a face carved from hard living, and lowered his voice to a rumble that seemed to carry the weight of both law and warning. A girl don't end up shaved, bald, barefoot, and thrown to the coyotes without a reason. Men who leave a child like that, they don't just vanish. They'll come looking. And when they do, you'll wish to God you'd left her where you found her. Elias held his ground, though the weight of those words pressed heavy against the hollow ache of his chest, stirring the memories of the graves he had left behind, the faces he could not save, the blood that stained his hands no matter how far he rode. His jaw tightened, the muscle ticking as he looked past the sheriff to the girl outside, standing barefoot on the sun-baked boards of the street, her head bowed, her silence drawing the stares of every soul like flies to a corpse. And something in him hardened, something that whispered he would not ride away this time, not add her to the long list of ghosts that already haunted him. Amos followed his gaze, sighed through his teeth, and muttered, You're a damn fool if you think you can carry her weight. That kind of silence, it ain't natural. Some say it's curse, some say it's shame. Either way, it's blood calling blood, and it'll find you before long. But Elias, whose silence had carried him through years of wandering, through nights when his own voice was drowned by the wind and the memories of those lost, shook his head slow and steady, his voice gravel when he finally spoke. Trouble don't scare me, Sheriff. I've carried worse. The lawman stared at him a long moment, as if weighing whether the drifter's stubbornness was courage or madness, then let out a bitter laugh, the sound dry as the desert itself, and stepped back, muttering, Then may God watch over you both, because the men who left her out there won't spare you, and when they come, this town won't lift a finger to stand in their way. Boone tipped his hat, said nothing more. But the decision was already carved into him like a brand, his jaw locked, his spine straight as he stepped back into the blazing sun. The girl's eyes, hollow yet fixed on him as though she had known all along what he would choose, met his own, and though no word passed her lips, Elias understood something clear as gunfire trouble or not. He would not abandon her. Not now. Not ever. The desert night pressed in around their meager camp, stars pricking the sky like cold lanterns while the fire crackled low, throwing shadows long and jagged across the scrub, and Elias Boone sat with his hat tipped low, sharpening his knife more for comfort than need, his eyes drifting often to the girl who sat across from him, her bare feet drawn close beneath her. Her head bowed so the firelight glowed against her shaven scalp like a crown of ash. She made no sound, as always, but tonight there was movement, her thin finger tracing into the dirt, first clumsy lines, then deliberate strokes, symbols that at first seemed nonsense until Elias leaned closer and saw patterns emerge, characters strange to his eye, not the crude marks of a child but letters, perhaps words, from a language carried far across oceans, etched now into the desert soil as if to tether her to a life she had lost. He blinked, his throat tightening, for in those marks he saw not emptiness but memory, fragments of something too large and too painful for her to give voice, and he realized her silence was not ignorance but a wall built against the hurt, a barricade that kept her from drowning in whatever horror had left her stripped and abandoned. She paused often, her hand trembling as she shaped each figure, and he noticed that after every symbol her breath grew shallow, her body stiff, as though each remembered piece of herself was a wound reopening, and it struck him with a force he had not expected that she was not voiceless by nature but by choice, or by pain too deep to cross with words. Elias shifted, setting his knife aside, and spoke low, not certain if she understood but needing the words in the fire's glow. "You remember, don't you? More than you let on. You're not gone. Not all the way." She stilled, her finger hovering over the dirt, then pressed down again to carve one last symbol before wiping her hand across it, erasing everything in a swift, almost angry sweep, as though ashamed of having revealed it, or afraid of what the knowledge might bring, and the fire popped sharply, scattering sparks into the night like the fragments of memory she had just destroyed. Elias swallowed hard, staring at the smudged ground, and a chill ran through him not from the cold but from the certainty that whoever had stripped this child bare had done so not to kill her but to bury her alive within herself, to leave her husk wandering the earth while her past burned behind her. And though he had no kinship with symbols or foreign words, he felt the weight of them settle into his bones, a promise he did not speak aloud, that if she could not carry her story, he would carry it for her until she found her voice again. She looked at him then, just a flicker, her hollow eyes catching the firelight, and though no sound passed her lips, something unspoken moved between them, fragile as smoke yet heavy as the desert night, and Elias Boone knew that the silence they shared was no longer empty, it was the beginning of trust. By the time Elias Boone reached the next town, a half-dead cluster of clapboard shacks strung along the rail line, the whispers had already found him, curling through the saloon's smoky air and drifting from the mouths of men too eager to trade in other folks' pain. It was in the corner booth, over the clink of cheap whiskey glasses, that he heard the word First Railroad Gang, a pack of cutthroats who bled the land dry under the guise of laying track. Men who took what they pleased from the immigrant camps that shadowed the rail, leaving graves where families had once stood and when Boone pressed, offering coin he could ill afford. The drunk with the cracked lips and hollow eyes leaned forward and spat the truth that froze Elias cold. "Ain't sickness shaved that little one's head? That's what they do when they mean to break you, shame you so you're less than dirt. She's marked, mister. Marked by them." Elias sat back hard, his hand curling into a fist on the table, for the pieces fit too cleanly the silence, the hollow eyes, the symbols she scratched in the dirt by firelight, and it struck him like a hammer that she was not just some forsaken child but a survivor, branded and broken by men who treated lives as nothing more than obstacles in their way. His jaw clenched until his teeth ached, the old bitterness rising in his chest, that burn he knew from other nights, other faces he had failed to protect, and though he had never sought cause in his wandering, never looked for justice beyond the barrel of his Colt, when pressed, he felt a line drawn in the dust at his boots, a line that meant he could not turn away. Not this time. Outside. The girl sat in the wagon bed, her eyes following the men who passed with that same unreadable stillness. And Elias, watching her, knew she carried more knowledge than she revealed, knew that in her silence she remembered every face, every hand, every cruelty, though her lips would not shape the words, and the thought made his blood burn hotter. He asked more questions, sought out the freight handler at the station, a man with soot on his clothes and fear in his eyes, who admitted in a hush that the gang had passed through not 3 weeks prior, taking food, taking coin, taking children for labor or worse, and when Elias pressed again, the man only shook his head, muttering, "They don't leave survivors unless they mean to send a message. Shave the hair, strip the name. That's their way." Boone left the station with his jaw set, the girl's fragile frame clinging to his shadow as he walked, and though no vow passed his lips, he felt it settle in him like a brand seared deep. He would find the men who had done this, trail them to whatever hole they crawled into, and make certain that the mark they had burned into her life did not stand unchallenged. The desert wind swept hot across the street, carrying the faint wail of the whistle down the line. And in that sound Boone heard not progress but chains, the grinding of steel laid over bones, and he reckoned the time had come for a reckoning of his own. The night broke open with fire first, a low crackle, then a roar that clawed against the sky as orange tongues licked high above the horizon, pulling Elias Boone from uneasy sleep. He was on his feet before the girl even stirred, Colt in hand, heart pounding with the certainty that the past had found them at last, and when he crested the ridge near the farmer's spread where they had been granted shelter, he saw the barn ablaze, timbers snapping like bones, livestock shrieking in terror as sparks scattered into the dark, and beyond the flames, silhouettes on horseback circling like wolves, their laughter carrying cruel and sharp across the plain. Elias knew without needing to ask who they were, the railroad gang, the same butchers who had shorn the girl bare, their cruelty unfinished, their arrogance unshaken, and this fire was no simple theft, no raid for supplies, but a warning, a message written in flame. We know where she is, and we will take her back. The farmer stumbled into the yard, shotgun clutched in his hands but useless against a dozen riders, his wife screaming as she tried to herd their children toward the root cellar. And Elias felt the old fury rise, that helpless rage he had carried since the day his brother was cut down, since the day he buried his wife beneath stony soil, a fury that had driven him to wander but never to stand, not until now. He turned to the girl, who stood barefoot in the dirt beside him, her face unreadable in the firelight but her eyes fixed on the riders, not with fear but with something colder, something that chilled him more than the flame's recognition. She knew them, every shape, every voice, every cruel laugh, and though she made no sound, the tremor in her frame told him she carried scars deeper than the eye could see. Elias crouched low, his voice gravel and steel. "No more running, girl. Not tonight. Not ever again." The words tasted strange in his mouth, for he had never sworn himself to any cause beyond survival. But as the barn collapsed with a shattering boom, he felt the vow settle deep. As binding as iron, he strode out into the yard, the fire casting him in silhouette, and leveled his Colt at the riders who circled like vultures, his voice booming above the crackle. "You want her? Then come through me." The gang's laughter faltered, replaced by curses, the ring of spurs, the tightening of reins, and he saw it in their eyes. Even from across the firelight they hadn't expected a stand, hadn't expected a man to choose defiance over fear. But Elias Boone was no longer the drifter who took what the world gave and rode on. He was anchored now by silence heavier than any burden, by the fragile weight of a child who had been stripped of everything. And though his hand shook with the knowledge that he was outnumbered, outgunned, he refused to yield, for some ghosts could only be buried by fire and blood. Behind him the girl's breath came shallow, her shadow small against the blaze, and Elias knew the fight would come by dawn, but he welcomed it. For running was done, and the time for reckoning had finally arrived. The night erupted in thunder as the first gunshot split the air, a hot streak of lead tearing past Elias Boone's ear and embedding itself into the farmhouse wall. And in that instant the yard became a battlefield, the fire from the burning barn casting everything in a hellish glow while shadows of mounted men wheeled and charged, their pistols spitting fire like sparks from the devil's forge. Elias dropped to one knee, his colt barking back in reply, the recoil jolting through his arm as he sent a rider tumbling from the saddle with a strangled cry. And the girl, small, barefoot, her shaven head glinting in the light, scrambled into the far corner of the porch, pressing herself into the wood, her silence unbroken, even as death howled around her. Her wide eyes locked on him with a faith that struck deeper than fear. Bullets split the air, shattering windows, splintering wood, and Elias moved like a man possessed, ducking behind a rain barrel, rolling through the dirt, his revolver flashing again and again until the acrid haze of gunpowder thickened in his lungs, his heart hammering with a grim rhythm that told him this fight was not for glory or survival but for innocence, for the fragile soul huddled in the corner who had already been stripped of everything but life, and he would not see even that stolen. The farmer fired wildly from the porch rail, his hands shaking, his shotgun booming, while his wife shielded the children in the cellar, her sobs drowned by the chaos, and Elias felt the weight of every life pressing on his shoulders as he reloaded with trembling hands, the click of each cartridge a vow sealed with powder and steel. A rider thundered in close, swinging down with a pistol aimed at the girl, and Elias moved without thought, rising into the open, his colt spitting fire that dropped the outlaw before he reached the porch, the man's blood soaking into the dust at her feet, and though she did not scream, did not weep, her gaze followed Elias as if binding him with invisible cords, as if to say without words that he was her shield, her anchor, her last chance. The fight raged long and savage, gunfire echoing against the empty plains, the flames painting every figure in gold and red until the yard was a vision of hell itself. And though Elias felt bullets graze his arm, tear through his coat, he did not falter, his boots steady, his aim true, until at last the gang, thinned and broken, turned their horses into the night, their curses carried off by the wind. Silence fell jagged, broken only by the crackle of the dying barn and the moans of the fallen, blood dark in the dust, mingled with the acrid tang of smoke, and Elias stood panting, shoulders heaving, his colt dangling loose in his grip, the cost of the fight written in the dead scattered at his feet. Slowly, he turned, his eyes seeking her, and there she was, still huddled in the corner, her small frame trembling but alive, untouched, her silence intact though her gaze blazed with something new, trust, fragile and fierce, a bond born in the crucible of blood and fire. And Elias Boone, scarred, weary, his body ringing with pain, felt the weight of what he had done settle into his bones. He had fought not for himself, but for innocence, and though the soil was stained red, she was safe, and that made the cost bearable. The fire smoldered low in the ruins of the barn, embers glowing like dying stars across the blackened timbers, and the night air carried the acrid sting of smoke mingled with the copper tang of blood, a silence heavy after so much thunder, broken only by the faint creak of wood and the distant cry of coyotes testing the edges of death's feast. Elias Boone sat on the porch steps, his colt still in his hand, though his arm trembled with fatigue, his shirt torn and streaked with blood that was both his own and not, and his eyes hollow, raw, kept drifting to the small figure crouched in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her shaven head bowed, the flames glow etching her into something that looked too fragile to have survived the storm. Yet there she was, breathing, alive. The weight of his vow pressed into every breath he took. For a long time she was silent as ever, her eyes fixed on him with that unreadable stillness, until at last she shifted, uncurling slowly, and her lips parted dry, hesitant, like a door creaking open after years sealed shut, and a single word spilled into the night, trembling and soft but sharp enough to cut through the silence. May. Elias blinked, the name sinking into him with a force greater than gunfire. Because it was more than a word, it was a reclamation, a defiance against the men who had stripped her bare, a secret she had carried through fire and dust, now given to him as if entrusting him with her very soul. The sound of it, fragile and fierce, seemed to echo in the night, turning the ruined yard into sacred ground, and though she lowered her eyes quickly, ashamed or fearful of what she had revealed, Elias spoke it back to her, his voice rough, broken, but steady. May. He let it hang there, heavy and real, a tether between them, and for the first time since he had lifted her from the scorched earth, the silence eased, not vanished, but softened, as though the weight had shifted from curse to choice. She looked up then, her hollow eyes gleaming wet though no tears fell, and the faintest tremor passed her lips, not quite a smile, not quite grief, but something in between, and Elias felt the bond cinch tight, stronger than any blood or law, for a name spoken was a life reclaimed, and now she was not just a burden he had carried or a ghost he had stumbled upon, but May, a child with history, with identity, with a voice that had broken through pain and fear. He reached out, slow so as not to startle her, and set his rough hand on her shoulder, the touch light but firm, and she did not pull away, did not flinch, only drew in a breath as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. Above them the stars wheeled bright and cold, indifferent to fire and blood. Yet Elias Boone felt for the first time in years that something larger than himself had been set right, that the trail had not given him a burden but a charge, a purpose, and as the coyote's howls faded into the distance, he whispered her name once more into the smoke-stained night. May, a promise carved in syllables that he would not let her be lost again. Morning broke slow over Red Bluff, the sky painted in bruised shades of violet and gold, and when Elias Boone rode back into town with the girl May now, not just the silent wraith he had lifted from the desert, he expected only the weight of stares, the mutters of suspicion, the turning of backs as had greeted them before. Yet the air shifted different this time, hushed in a way that made even his trail-worn heart pause. For the townsfolk who once spat omens and curses now lingered on the boardwalks with eyes lowered, their mouths tight, not with scorn but with something like shame. And slowly, as the dust settled around his boots, they came forward not in a rush, not with fanfare, but in hesitant trickles, carrying things that seemed too small against the enormity of what had passed, yet heavier than any coin purse. A pair of shoes, worn but sturdy, set down in the dust before May's bare feet, by a weathered woman whose own child clung shyly at her skirts. A dress, rough, spun but whole, offered by a seamstress who could not quite meet Elias's eye. A small sack of flour, a tin of beans, a folded blanket, all laid at their feet like offerings, not for charity but for penance, tokens of humanity scraped from hearts that had been hardened by suspicion until they had seen blood spilled and fire burned by men far crueler than any superstition could conjure. Elias watched May as she stood, her thin frame still marked by silence, but her eyes wide as the shoes settled before her, eyes that shimmered with something new, something fragile and unfamiliar wonder. She bent slow, fingers trembling as she touched the leather, tracing its seams as though it were treasure, and when she slipped her feet inside, her toes curling into warmth she had long been denied, Elias felt a knot in his chest loosen, the sight of her no longer barefoot in the dust striking him harder than the memory of gunfire, for it was proof that even the smallest kindness could mend what cruelty had tried to erase. The sheriff stood at the edge of the street, arms folded, his gaze unreadable, but he did not intervene, did not warn. He only nodded once, curt but approving, as though conceding that Boone's defiance had shifted more than the course of one child's fate. It had cracked something in the town itself. Murmurs rippled through the gathered folk, some still hesitant, some still suspicious, but none daring to speak of curses now, for the sight of the drifter who had stood against fire and blood had silenced such talk, replaced it with a reluctant respect that clung even as envy simmered beneath. May clutched the shoes to her feet, the blanket wrapped clumsily around her shoulders, and though she said nothing, her hand slipped into Boone's rough palm as they turned from the gathering, and Elias, feeling the weight of it, realized this was not charity she had been given but recognition that she was seen, named, clothed, fed, no longer the ghost they feared but a child they could not deny. As they walked on, the gifts rustling in the saddlebag, Elias tipped his hat low, not in thanks but in acknowledgement, for he knew gestures were not enough to erase cruelty, not enough to protect her from what still hunted them. Yet in the quiet of that morning he allowed himself the rarest of luxuries, the belief that even in a place as harsh as Red Bluff, humanity could still spark, and for May, that spark was worth carrying. The dawn rose pale and red over the desert rim, a fire of its own kind spreading across the sky as Elias Boone tightened the cinch on his horse, the leather creaking beneath his hands, and beside him May stood in her new shoes, the blanket draped about her shoulders, her shaven head glowing like polished stone in the morning light. The town still slept in wary silence, but Boone felt no pull to linger. He had given them their chance to reckon, And what had been offered was enough, but not enough to root them there. For he knew the frontier held long memories and deeper grudges. And someday the whispers would return, the suspicion would fester, and the men who had marked May would ride again, seeking to finish what they had begun. Better to keep moving, better to carve their own trail rather than wait for the past to catch up, and as he swung into the saddle, he paused, holding out a rough hand not as command but as invitation. May looked at him, her hollow eyes now carrying the faintest glimmer of trust. And she climbed up steady, no longer the ghost he had found in the dust, but a child reborn with name and place. Her small frame pressed to his back as the horse shifted beneath them. He glanced east, where the horizon stretched endless, and for the first time in years, the emptiness did not taste of loneliness but of possibility. The long road ahead no longer a punishment but a promise. As the first warmth of sun touched their faces, he muttered low, half to himself, half to her. Not a burden, May. Family now. The word hung in the cool air, simple yet heavier than any vow he had ever spoken. And he felt her arms tighten around his waist, a silent answer, stronger than speech. The horse started forward, hooves crunching the dirt in steady rhythm, and the town fell away behind them, shrinking to a smear against the land, while the wide, wild west unfurled before them like an unbroken page, daring them to write upon it. Boone knew there would be trials yet, outlaws lurking, hunger biting, storms tearing down from the mountains, but none of it could erase what had been forged in fire and blood, her name reclaimed, her silence broken, their bond sealed. The men who had tried to strip her to nothing had failed, and though they would come again, though the rails would stretch further and the land would swallow more lives, she would not be erased, not while he still drew breath. And as the horizon opened wide, Elias Boone allowed himself something rare, something dangerous, hope. The trail ahead shimmered with heat, coyotes loped in the distance, and the world seemed poised to test them anew, yet he carried her with him not as a reminder of cruelty but as a defiance of it. Proof that even in a land where mercy was scarce as rain, a man and a child could carve a future the West itself could not burn away. The sun climbed higher, their shadows stretched long before them, and Elias Boone rode on with May, not into exile but into belonging. Two souls bound by silence, by survival, and now, at last, by family.